Black cats and goblins and broomsticks and ghosts, covens of witches with all of their hosts. You may think they scare me, you're probably right. Black cats and goblins on Halloween night. Black cats and goblins and broomsticks and ghosts, covens of witches with all of their hosts. You may think they scare me, you're probably right. Black cats and goblins on Halloween night.
It is said that Halloween night is when the veil between our world and the next is at its thinnest, allowing the strange and the terrifying to creep into the realm of the living. On this eerie night, when the air is filled with the scent of pumpkins and decay, and the moon casts long shadows on the ground, some stories refuse to remain untold. Tonight, we gather around the fire not for warmth, but for fear. We summon 10 tales, dark and twisted, to keep you company as the clock strikes midnight and the whispers of the forgotten stir in the air. These stories are not just fiction, they are warnings, signs of what could happen when you least expect it. Listen closely, for Halloween isn't just about the candy and the costumes. It's about the things that lurk in the dark corners, just beyond the edge of your vision. Now, brace yourselves as we journey into the unknown, where shadows grow longer and silence grows louder. Here are 10 stories to haunt your Halloween.
It was supposed to be just another Halloween night for Heather and Lily, two best friends who had decided to stay in and watch horror movies. Heather's parents were out for the night, and with the house to themselves, the girls had turned the living room into their private screening area. The bowl of candy sat untouched, and the streets outside were eerily quiet for Halloween. As they laughed over the jump scares in their movie, the doorbell rang. It was almost midnight, too late for trick-or-treaters. They exchanged puzzled glances. Must be some kids pulling a prank, Heather said with a shrug, rising to answer the door. But as she reached for the handle, there was a loud bang, bang, bang against the door, like someone was pounding with their fists. Heather hesitated, but then opened the door a crack. There, standing on the porch, was a man dressed in a dirty mechanic's jumpsuit, his face hidden behind a sack with 2 cut-out eye holes. He stood perfectly still, head slightly tilted to one side. "Trick or treat?" Heather asked, her voice wavering. The man didn't respond. He simply stood there, breathing heavily, a low rasp coming from beneath the sack. Lily joined Heather at the door, her eyes wide with fear. "What do you want?" Lily asked, gripping Heather's arm tightly. The man raised a hand, pointing at the 2 girls, then rasped a single word. "Souls." Heather slammed the door shut, locking it quickly. Both girls backed away, hearts pounding. "Call the police," Lily urged. Heather fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed. But when she pressed the phone to her ear, there was no signal. "No, no, no, no!" she whispered, her voice cracking with panic. Suddenly, the pounding on the door resumed, harder this time. The man outside was relentless. "Go away!" Heather screamed, but the pounding continued. They grabbed kitchen knives, terrified, ready to defend themselves. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the pounding stopped. There was a long silence, followed by the sound of footsteps retreating down the porch steps. The police arrived 20 minutes later. They searched the area, but found no sign of the man. The officer assured the girls that it was likely a prank. But when Heather and Lily looked out the window after the police left, they saw the man standing at the end of the street, staring at them, his sack mask illuminated by the faint glow of a streetlight. Daniel and his best friend, Mark, were driving home from a Halloween party, the road stretching ahead like a dark ribbon through the woods. The laughter and chatter from the party were still fresh in their minds, but as they wound through the forest, a strange sound reached their ears, a rhythmic low chant. "You hear that?" Mark asked, turning down the car stereo. Daniel nodded, slowing the car. The sound was coming from the woods, an eerie, melodic chant that seemed to echo from the trees. Without thinking, they pulled over and got out of the car. "Let's check it out," Mark suggested, grinning. But Daniel felt a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. Something about the chant was wrong. They followed the sound deeper into the forest, the chanting growing louder with each step. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. Eventually, they reached a clearing, where a group of people stood in a circle around a massive bonfire. They wore white robes and masks, their faces hidden behind expressions of joy, sorrow and rage. The chant was louder now, almost deafening. The firelight flickered and danced, casting strange, twisted shadows across the clearing. Daniel and Mark watched, frozen in place. The robed figures moved in unison, swaying to the rhythm of their chant. "What the hell is this?" Daniel whispered, his breath fogging in the cold air. Before Mark could respond, the chanting stopped. In perfect unison, the figures turned to face them, their masked eyes locked onto the two intruders. The fire seemed to grow brighter, the flames licking higher into the night sky. "We need to get out of here," Mark whispered, tugging on Daniel's arm. But as they turned to run, the chanting resumed, louder and faster. The robed figures began to move toward them, their steps slow and deliberate, their masks glowing in the firelight. Panic surged through Daniel as they bolted back toward the car. The chanting grew louder, chasing them through the trees. When they finally reached the car and slammed the doors shut, the chanting stopped abruptly. They sped off, leaving the clearing behind. Neither of them spoke, but they both knew. They'd stumbled upon something they were never meant to see. Tom had owned his pop-up Halloween store for years. Every fall, he rented out an old vacant building and stocked it with costumes, masks, and decorations. It was a good business, but this year, something felt different. The air in the store felt colder, heavier, as though the shadows between the aisles had grown darker. One night, near closing time, a customer walked in. Tall and lanky, with long, bony fingers that twitched nervously, the man moved through the store with unsettling stillness. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. He wandered the aisles without saying a word, occasionally touching his face as though he were trying to scratch an itch that didn't exist. Tom watched him from behind the counter, an uneasy feeling gnawing at him. There was something off about the man, something that made the hair on the back of Tom's neck stand up. He wasn't sure what it was, but the man's presence filled the store with an oppressive silence. "Can I help you find something?" Tom finally asked, his voice sounding too loud in the stillness. The man didn't respond. He simply turned and looked at Tom with those hollow, sunken eyes. Then, without a word, he walked to the back of the store and disappeared behind the shelves. Tom waited, but the man never came back. When he went to check the back of the store, there was no sign of the customer. He was gone, as if he had vanished into thin air. The store felt colder, the shadows longer. Tom hurried to lock up and left without looking back. But later that night, as he lay in bed, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. When he looked out the window, the tall, lanky figure was standing across the street, staring up at his apartment with those same hollow eyes. Jake had been looking forward to the Halloween party for weeks. It was the biggest one of the year, and his best friend Michael had convinced him to come. The night had been fun. Costumes, drinks, music. But by midnight, Jake was ready to leave. "Hey, let's head out," Jake said to Michael, who was leaning against the wall in his vampire costume. Michael nodded, and the two of them slipped out of the crowded house into the cool night air. The streets were quiet as they walked toward Jake's car, but something about the silence felt wrong. Jake glanced at Michael, who hadn't said a word since they left the party. He seemed distant, his expression blank. "You okay?" Jake asked. Michael didn't respond. Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting a message from someone at the party, but his heart nearly stopped when he saw the name on the screen, Michael. He turned to the man walking beside him, panic rising in his chest. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, backing away. The imposter smiled, a slow, twisted grin that sent a chill down Jake's spine.
"You were never supposed to leave the party,"
it whispered, its voice unnaturally distorted. Jake bolted, running faster than he ever had in his life. He could hear the imposter's footsteps behind him, gaining on him with each passing second. But as he turned a corner, the footsteps stopped. He looked back, but the imposter was gone. When he finally reached his car, his phone buzzed again. It was Michael, the real Michael, calling him. "Where are you, man? I've been looking for you."
"Let us in. Let us in. Let us in."
Katie had just gotten home from a long day at work. Halloween was never her favorite holiday, but she still had a bowl of candy out for the trick-or-treaters. She unlocked the front door, kicked off her shoes, and flicked on the lights. That's when she noticed the handprints. They were smeared across the front door, small, almost childlike, but not quite. The fingers were too long, the palms too narrow, and the prints ended in sharp, pointed tips, like claws. Her stomach twisted. Had someone tried to break in? She glanced around, but nothing seemed out of place. A knock echoed through the house. Katie froze. The knock hadn't come from the front door, but from somewhere deeper inside the house. Her heart pounded as she slowly crept through the hallway. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, as though someone, or something, was trapped inside her home. She reached the back door and hesitated. The knocking stopped. For a moment, the house was deathly silent. Then a voice whispered from the shadows, soft and childlike. "Let us in." Katie ran out of the house, her breath coming in short gasps. But as she looked back, she saw them. Dozens of tiny handprints smeared across every window, every door, all reaching toward the inside. Emma had always been the independent type. At 17, she wasn't afraid to spend a little time alone, especially with her parents gone on a business trip for 2 weeks. She had the house all to herself, and on Halloween night, that felt like a blessing. No pesky trick-or-treaters, no siblings to bother her, just her and a horror movie marathon. She'd been looking forward to it for weeks. The house was quiet, the candy bowl was full, and the living room lights flickered as the first movie began. As the night stretched on, the house began to settle. Emma chalked up the occasional creaks and groans to old pipes and floorboards. But as the movie reached its climax, she heard something else, a faint noise coming from upstairs. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping like fingers drumming on a surface. She paused the movie and listened. The sound stopped. "Probably nothing," she muttered, shaking off the unease creeping up her spine. She hit play, but just a few moments later, the tapping resumed. This time louder, more distinct. She muted the TV. The sound wasn't just upstairs, it was coming from her bedroom. Emma swallowed the lump in her throat. It had to be her imagination playing tricks on her, she reasoned. After all, she'd been watching horror movies all night. But when she turned her head towards the stairs, she noticed something strange. The door to her bedroom, which she always kept closed, was now slightly ajar. A soft creak echoed down the hall as the door moved, as though someone had gently nudged it. Grabbing her phone, she dialed her parents, but the call didn't go through. The signal was dead. She tried the landline, but there was nothing but static. Emma's heart raced. She wasn't alone. But then, a text pinged on her phone. It was from an unknown number. You left the door open. Her blood turned cold. Panic surged through her. She bolted to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The lock was jammed. A shadow moved across the upstairs landing, slow and deliberate, as if toying with her. She backed away, her mind racing. Whoever was upstairs wanted her to know they were there. Suddenly, footsteps echoed down the stairs. Slow, deliberate, each step making the wood groan under the weight of the intruder. Emma scrambled for a weapon, grabbing a kitchen knife from the counter just as the figure came into view at the bottom of the stairs. It was tall, dressed in dark clothing, its face obscured by a hood. With nowhere else to go, Emma bolted for the back door. But as she pulled it open, she froze. The backyard was empty, save for one thing. Handprints, smeared across the glass, leading away from the house. They were fresh. Whoever had been inside was now outside, and close. The figure from the stairs stood behind her now, and as she turned, she saw a glint of something metallic in their hand. But before the figure could lunge, the lights flickered out, and the house was plunged into darkness. She ran, stumbling through the night, no longer concerned with where she was going, just that she needed to escape. In the distance, the faintest sound of trick-or-treaters could be heard, a reminder that while the rest of the world celebrated, she was being hunted.
You mustn't refuse.
It was a Halloween tradition. James, Carla, and Kevin had been trick-or-treating together since they were kids, but as they grew older, they began to push the boundaries of their town's festivities, venturing further each year to see what lurked beyond their usual route. That's how they found themselves at the end of Harlow Street, in front of a dilapidated house that was barely visible behind overgrown bushes and dead trees. "Nobody lives here," Carla whispered, her breath visible in the cold night air. "Let's just skip it," but Kevin, always the daring one, grinned. "Come on, it's Halloween, what's the worst that could happen?" Before they could argue, Kevin knocked on the old weather-beaten door. For a moment, nothing happened. The wind howled through the dead branches, and the house remained still, as though it had been abandoned for years. But then the door creaked open, revealing a figure standing in the shadows. It was an old woman, hunched over with age, her thin, bony fingers gripping the edge of the door. Her eyes were sunken into her skull, and her face was a patchwork of deep wrinkles and cracked skin. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "Trick or treat," Kevin said, his voice suddenly unsure. The woman said nothing, only extended her hand. In her palm were pieces of old-fashioned candy wrapped in faded yellowing paper. "Take it," she rasped, her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Carla took a step back, feeling a sense of dread wash over her. "No, thank you," she said quickly. But Kevin, ever the fool, grabbed a handful. The woman's bony fingers closed around his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "You mustn't refuse," she whispered, her eyes locking onto Kevin's. "You'll regret it." Terrified, Kevin yanked his arm free, and the three friends bolted down the street, not stopping until they were out of sight of the house. Kevin laughed it off, but there was something about the woman's grip, her cold, dead eyes, that had unnerved him. Later that night, after they'd all gone home, Kevin couldn't resist eating the candy. He unwrapped a piece, the strange, sweet smell wafting into the air. But as soon as he bit down, a sharp pain shot through his mouth. He spit the candy out, and with it came a tooth, rotten and blackened. Panicking, he ran to the mirror and watched in horror as his teeth began to rot one by one, decaying rapidly before his eyes. His gums bled. and his breath reeked of death. His reflection twisted, showing not a young man, but an old, withered version of himself. The next morning, his friends found Kevin's house empty. He was gone, and so was any trace of the candy. Only a pile of dust remained where he had stood the night before.
But I am still here.
For weeks, Mia had been plagued by nightmares. They started subtly, a strange figure lurking at the edge of her dreams, always watching but never moving. But as Halloween approached, the figure grew bolder, closer, until it wasn't just a presence in her dreams. It was in her room, standing at the foot of her bed. Each night, Mia would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding as the figure loomed over her. It was always the same, a tall, shadowy silhouette with glowing red eyes, its face obscured by darkness. She could never make out its features, but she could feel its gaze burning into her soul. On the night of Halloween, Mia tried to stay awake. She downed coffee, paced around her room, and even left the lights on. But eventually, exhaustion overtook her, and she drifted into sleep. This time, the dream was different. She wasn't in her room. She was in a dark, endless forest. The trees twisted and gnarled like the limbs of some great beast. The figure was there, standing in the distance, its eyes glowing brighter than ever. She turned to run, but the forest seemed to close in around her, the branches grabbing at her clothes, pulling her back toward the figure. In the real world, Mia thrashed in her bed, her body convulsing as the nightmare took hold. And then she woke, or so she thought. Sitting up in bed, she let out a sigh of relief. The figure was gone, the nightmare over. But then she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable.
I'm still here.
Two figures appeared at the foot of her bed, their faces shrouded in darkness. They weren't just part of her nightmare anymore. They were real. It was a chilly October night, the kind that bites at your skin, but fills your lungs with a crisp, almost refreshing air. Jane had stayed at her friend's house longer than expected, and now found herself walking home alone. The streets were empty, silent, except for the soft crunch of fallen leaves beneath her boots. The only light came from the dim street lamps that cast long, eerie shadows on the pavement. Her breath came out in puffs of white mist, and she pulled her coat tighter around herself. As she turned onto a quieter street, she noticed something strange out of the corner of her eye. A man stood on the opposite sidewalk, motionless. At first, she didn't think much of it. Just another pedestrian, she told herself. But when she glanced back, she saw that he wasn't just standing. He was staring at her. Jane's heart skipped a beat. There was something off about the man. His posture was unnaturally stiff, his body rigid, and most unsettling of all was his face. His mouth stretched into an impossibly wide smile, as though it had been frozen in place. Her pace quickened, and she crossed the street trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. She told herself not to look back, but her curiosity got the better of her. She stole another glance over her shoulder. The man was following her now. He wasn't running, not even walking quickly, but his deliberate, almost casual pace made her skin crawl. That eerie grin was still plastered on his face, his eyes locked on her. Jane's pulse raced, and she felt a wave of panic swell in her chest. She quickened her steps again, hoping to shake him off. But every time she glanced back, he was still there, keeping pace with her, the same unsettling smile never faltering. Jane's mind raced. What does he want? She wasn't far from home now, just a few more blocks. She could make it. She had to. As she neared an alley, she felt a cold sweat drip down her spine. Her footsteps echoed louder now, a steady rhythm that only heightened her anxiety. She risked one last glance over her shoulder. The smiling man had stopped. He stood at the entrance of the alley, completely still, watching her with that same horrible grin. And then, without warning, he raised his arm and pointed directly at her. Jane's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't think straight anymore. She broke into a run, her feet slapping the pavement as she sprinted the last few blocks to her apartment. Every step felt like it took forever, and she could almost feel his presence closing in on her. She reached her building, fumbled with her keys, and rushed inside, slamming the door behind her. She leaned against it, panting, her body trembling with fear. For a moment, everything was silent. But then, there was a soft tap on the window. Her stomach dropped. Slowly, she turned to look. There he was, standing just outside her window, still smiling. Jane's breath caught in her throat as she backed away from the window. She grabbed her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed 911. Her voice cracked as she explained what was happening to the operator. They assured her that police would be there shortly, but every second felt like an eternity. The man didn't move. He just stood there, staring, smiling like he was waiting for something. That twisted grin, the glint in his eyes. It was as if he knew something she didn't. The sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, and Jane dared to peek out again. But this time, the man was gone. When the police arrived, they searched the area but found no trace of him. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. Jane was left with a sense of dread that followed her for days. She never saw the smiling man again, but she never walked home alone at night after that. And every time she saw someone standing still in the distance, she couldn't help but wonder. Was he watching her again, waiting for the next moment to strike? Some smiles, she realized, weren't meant to bring comfort. They were meant to terrify. On the outskirts of town stood an old decrepit mansion that had been abandoned for decades. It was a place the local kids whispered about in hushed tones, a place everyone swore was haunted. But for David and his friends, it was the perfect place for one final Halloween prank. They arrived just before midnight, flashlights in hand, daring each other to enter the crumbling house. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet as they stepped inside, the air thick with dust and decay. "Come on, let's split up," David said, grinning. "We'll meet back here in 10 minutes. His friends reluctantly agreed, and they each wandered off into different parts of the house. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of the old house settling. David wandered through the dark hallways, his flashlight casting long shadows on the peeling wallpaper. But after 10 minutes, when he returned to the foyer, no one else was there. He waited, calling out their names, but the house remained silent. His friends had vanished. Panic began to creep in. He searched the house, calling for them, but there was no sign of his friends. Finally, in the attic, he found a message scrawled on the wall in what looked like old, dried blood. "You shouldn't have come." David's flashlight flickered, and in the dim light, he saw something move in the corner of the attic. A shadowy figure, its eyes glowing with malice. Before he could scream, the door slammed shut behind him.
And so, dear listeners, as you extinguish the final candle, ask yourself, which of these stories will visit you tonight? Halloween is a night of whispers and shadows, a time when the things that hide in the dark step forward and remind us how fragile our grip on reality truly is. If these stories made your spine tingle, imagine the unseen, the untold stories lurking just beyond the edge of your consciousness. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do in the face of these terrors? And what if, just maybe, one of these stories finds its way to your door? As the witching hour approaches, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Keep your lights dim, but your wits sharp. Because the scariest part of Halloween might just be the part you never see coming. Happy Halloween and sweet dreams.